On the last day of March in Corpus Christi, Texas, the singer Selena was shot and killed, an event that barely merited a mention in the news of much of the world, but sent shockwaves through the American Latin community, where she'd become a major star of Tejano, also known as Tex-Mex music, and indeed had earlier in the year become the first artist to have a mostly Spanish-language album go straight in at the top of the Billboard Hot 200. Her murderer was the president of her fan club, Yolanda Saldivar, who, it came out in one of the most high-profile cases of the year, compared by some media outlets to the O.J. Simpson trial, had been embezzling millions from Selena's fashion business, in which she'd been appointed as a manager. Selena's birthday fell on April the 16th, just over 2 weeks after her death, and Texas State Governor George W. Bush, son of the former president, declared that day to be Selena Day, which is still marked by the Latin community in Texas and beyond. The nasty war in Chechnya, which had been grinding on since November, took an even nastier turn in early April when Russian soldiers, many of them part of the OMON Special Police Unit, massacred several hundred civilians, as usual, sources vary wildly as to the exact number, in the village of Samashki. Witnesses reported that many of the Russian troops were drunk or under the influence of drugs as they deployed flamethrowers to burn buildings, threw grenades into cellars where civilians were taking shelter, and fired indiscriminately. Russian sources claimed that the village had been harbouring Chechen separatist militia, and news agency TASS added that all those killed, they gave the number as 120, had been actively engaged in firing at the Russians at the time. And a few days before the Argentine Grand Prix, British comedian and DJ Kenny Everett died. He had started out as one of the DJs on the newly launched BBC Radio 1 in 1967 and quickly divided opinion for his breathlessly zany style, careering from impressions and silly voices to self-composed jingles. He was never a good fit with BBC Radio and moved to commercial radio once that became legal in the 1970s, though he never left the BBC fully, making several appearances as a host or co-host of flagship music show Top of the Pops, and provided the voice of Charlie the Cat in a fondly remembered series of public information films.
Charlie says that if ever you see a box of matches lying around, tell Mummy because they can hurt you.
Offered his own TV show in 1978, he became even more of a household name throughout the 1980s, but courted controversy by publicly endorsing Margaret Thatcher. Largely, he later explained, because Miners leader Arthur Scargill had really rubbed him up the wrong way. As an openly gay man, he took a lot of criticism for supporting the government that had brought in the notorious Section 28 clause. He responded by saying that he would advocate for gay rights as long as it was in a light-hearted context, and he felt it was more important to be visible as a minority being funny and human, rather than marching in the streets where it was easy to see him as an other. Like his friend Freddie Mercury, the cause of death was AIDS. And so the F1 teams arrived in Argentina for the first time since 1981. The 1982 edition had been originally delayed after a threatened driver's strike at the first race in South Africa saw the sponsors pull out, and then cancelled altogether in the wake of the Falklands War and sudden retirement of Carlos Reutemann later the same year. And despite one brief attempt to resurrect it in 1986, the circuit in the Villa Riachuelo Park had played host to Formula 2 and MotoGP events. It had previously been known as quite a fast track, with a long loop around the boating lake, but when at the insistence of President Carlos Menem the circuit began to ready itself for a new F1 bid, it was decided to abandon that section and instead modify the number 6 layout, producing a tight twisty circuit with only 2 straights, the start-finish and the short back straight, and a new chicane, inevitably named the Senna S, replacing the old toboggan corner. The drivers didn't seem overly enthusiastic looking at the layout on paper, but they would apparently have plenty of time to get used to the circuit, as the promoters had signed a 14-year contract with Bernie Ecclestone. One driver, though, nearly didn't make it to Argentina at all. Michael Schumacher had been scuba diving off the coast of Brazil after the race there, and surfaced to find his boat gone, having slipped its moorings and drifted off. Fortunately for him, he was incredibly fit and a strong swimmer, as he had to swim for nearly an hour to catch up with the boat. With the presidential election just a month away, and perhaps looking for a distraction after the tragic death of his rally driver son in a helicopter accident a few weeks earlier, Carlos Menem was visible throughout the weekend, but for many fans the big draw was Carlos Reutemann, who'd come second at the last race here in 1981, the year he came closest to the World Championship. There were 3 Argentine drivers in that race: Reutemann, Riccardo Zunino in one of the 2 races he drove for Tyrrell that year before being replaced by one Michele Alboreto, and Miguel Angel Guerra of Ozella, who failed to qualify, as he had done at the previous 2 meetings. Guerra would qualify for the next race at Imola, only to have a career-ending accident at the first corner. Since Reutemann's sudden retirement 2 races into the 1982 season, though, there had only been one Argentine driver in F1, Oscar Larrauri, who entered 21 races over 1988 and 89 for Eurobrunn, with just 8 starts and 2 finishes to his name. Young Norberto Fontana, Sauber's test driver, was with the team here, but it was indicative of his low profile that he apparently only signed 1 autograph all weekend. Of course, Carlos Reutemann was far from the most successful Argentine driver in F1. The great Juan Manuel Fangio had won 5 titles in the 1950s, a record which it didn't look like anyone would break soon. The champion, now 83, was very frail after a number of health problems, though he had continued being active where he could, meeting Ayrton Senna at the opening of the new Nürburgring in 1984 and forming a mentor-friend relationship with him, and often doing promotional work for Mercedes, with whom he'd won the 1954 and 55 titles. Fangio's absence from the track, having just emerged from the hospital after another heart attack, left a big gap, though in secret on Wednesday, as everyone was arriving, he met with the new Mercedes team, Ron Dennis, Mika Hakkinen, Mark Blundell, Norbert Haug, and press officer Walter Schattling, though could only manage half an hour's conversation. Quote, "After meeting Fangio, I felt prouder of my job as a driver," said Mark Blundell, no doubt reflecting that it should have been Nigel Mansell there to meet the great man. That same day, Carlos Reutemann, himself a politician now, governor of Santa Fe province and widely assumed to be Carlos Menem's successor, climbed into one of last year's Ferraris for a demonstration run around the circuit, holding an Argentine flag. The car had been numbered 11, which was the number El Lole had used in the 1978 season, in which he came 3rd in the Drivers' Championship. His driving skills were put to the test a little more than expected, because the weather on Wednesday was absolutely miserable, and the new surface was wet and rather slippy, but nobody wanted more than to see him slowly tour around, and he managed not to bin it. So much for nostalgia, though, because there was still a very live controversy going on in Formula One, with the so-called Elf affair still rumbling, 2 weeks after the disqualifications in Brazil of Schumacher and Coulthard. The intervening weeks had seen Elf declare that they would be supplying all 7 of their teams in Argentina with the same fuel that they'd used in Brazil, and asked the FIA to test it again in a proper lab, which they did, and declared the fuel legal for the Argentine weekend, but stopped short of rescinding the disqualifications. Elf's argument was that it was their different process which had produced the irregularity. Egypt, Mobil, and formerly Shell and so on, all produced the fuel they needed, then took a sample to send to the FIA for homologation, while ELF formulated the fuel, sent it for homologation, then once it was approved, manufactured what they needed, which gave them flexibility to tailor products to each engine, but of course meant that there was always a chance that one of the samples taken from the cars on the day wouldn't exactly match the start of season sample. The man from ELF, Michel Bonnet, naturally spent most of the weekend doing PR, in particular meeting with Jean Todt to try and defuse the tension that had grown up between them and the Scuderia, main beneficiary of the disqualifications. Especially some typically acerbic comments made by Niki Lauda, who was conveniently off in Japan promoting the Ferrari F40 sports car. Bonnet and Todt were all smiles afterwards, with Jean saying he would of course never suspect Elf of cheating and would abide by whatever the result of the appeals process was. There was more fuel-related aggro too, as Argentine customs officials decided to slap a tax on the 120,000 litres of ELF fuel arriving for the race, which resulted in another threatened boycott before President Menem intervened personally. There had been a change in the new regulations already too, with experience at Interlagos showing that the new engine size meant that cutting a hole in the airbox didn't actually make that much difference to the power, so the requirement was dropped and teams were able to use dynamic air intakes again. Goodyear also had a new type of tyre here, which of course everybody would be using, so there was plenty afoot in terms of car development already, in addition to the usual tweaks teams made between races. New side pods for the Benetton, new less rigid rear suspension on the McLarens, a modified rear wing and better gearbox software for the Jordan, and revised nose aerodynamics on the Minardi, as well as an extra element on their rear wing, as the team marked 10 years to the day on Friday that they and driver Pierluigi Martini made their F1 debut. Ferrari, meanwhile, had concentrated on making Alesi more comfortable in his cockpit after Jean had complained of poor posture in Brazil, while Berger was trying out a new Y-shaped steering wheel. It seemed to work for Alesi as he set the fastest time in the first practice session on Thursday, but it rained throughout and the practice and both qualifying sessions were held in the wet. Between the slippery surface and the unfamiliar circuit, almost everyone had a spin at some point on Friday, and the provisional grid looked interesting with Coulthard fastest, followed by Alesi, Frentzen, Hill, Berger and Häkkinen, with Schumacher and Herbert down in 9th and 10th, the latter just a tenth ahead of Luca Badoer's Minardi. On Saturday afternoon the rain was even heavier, and aside from going out to get a bit of track experience and sponsor coverage, nobody was really expecting to improve much. But the rain stopped, and with 10 minutes to go a dry line was emerging. Hill went out and took provisional pole off his teammate, which signalled a mass exodus onto the track as everyone else tried to get a lap or two in before it was too late. Häkkinen posted an identical time to Hill, who then went faster, but with just a couple of minutes to go, Coulthard went back out and went 0.8 seconds faster than Hill and had his first career pole. Schumacher likewise went out and took third in the dying seconds, so when the dust, or rather the spray, had settled, it was a Williams 1-2, the first since France last year, with Schumacher third alongside a delighted Eddie Irvine, his best grid slot ever. Mika Häkkinen was fifth alongside Alesi, with Salo also impressing mightily to park his Tyrrell seventh alongside Berger. Frentzen and Barrichello were on row 5, with Herbert 11th after going off in his attempt to improve on Saturday afternoon. Verstappen was an excellent 14th in the Simtek. Blundell, celebrating his 29th birthday, was disappointed to be down in 17th after just having timed his laps wrongly, while the Ligiers were well down after both drivers had skated off. Wendlinger still looked out of sorts in the other Sauber behind Schiattarella, who was quietly impressive in the second Simtek, and only Inoue's catalogue of spins prevented the 240s from being at the back. Roberto Moreno revealing here that he'd only actually been contracted for the first 2 rounds, with rumours putting Pedro Lamy in the car from Imola onwards, having apparently offered $2 million to Guido Forti. The weather was better on Sunday morning, but still damp and cold, as Hill went fastest in the warm-up ahead of the Ferraris, but by the time the race came around the track was more or less dry and the sky was lightening. Nobody had yet driven this circuit in fully dry conditions, especially with the brand new Goodyear tyres, so the race was still something of an unknown quantity, with many predicting that even without rain the race might well go all the way to its 2-hour limit. Despite the weather, there was a decent turnout, and the fans looked cheerful enough to be at their country's first race in a generation. Unlike Brazil, everyone made it round the parade lap and it was time to go. Coulthard made a perfect start to lead into the first corner, but behind him the 2 Ferraris made the slightest of contact, spinning Alesi 180 degrees and causing absolute chaos, as Salo took avoiding action and got rear-ended by Badoer, pushing him into Herbert's Benetton, while Panis and Martini touched wheels, launching the Ligier into the gravel, while the Minardi kept going, but only until he collided with Barrichello at the next corner, the Jordan having been tipped into a spin by a recovering Herbert. With 4 cars stationary on or next to the track and bits of car everywhere, out came the red flags. So Coulthard would have it all to do again as Messrs Panis, Alesi, Badoer, Martini and Barrichello jogged back to the pits to get in their spares, but with both Minardis out and only one spare, Badoer's weekend was over already. With the race being reset for its full distance and fuel tanks topped off, he would go down as a DNS. Tyrrell patched up both of their cars on the grid, a new nose for Katayama, new front and rear ends for Salo, while the spare Jordan had been assigned to Eddie Irvine, who was further up on the grid, and it took so long to get it reset for Barrichello that Rubens would have to take the restart from the pit lane. So 20 minutes after the first start, the rest set off for a second parade lap, with Wendlinger stalling and having to start from the back of the grid. On came the green lights, and away they went again, and again Coulthard got a great start to hold his lead, this time with Schumacher getting away even better to go second, but Häkkinen got in front of Irvine and hadn't left enough room before cutting back across, leading to contact, more bits of debris flying around, and a puncture, sending the McLaren off into the gravel, all of which had put Salo up to 4th, as Irvine headed in for a new front wing. Further back, and missed by the cameras in all the excitement, Wendlinger had completely missed his braking point, bounced off Montemini's Pacific and collided with gauchos, sending Burt spinning out, Monty in to retire at the end of the lap, and himself out with suspension damage. So Coulthard led Schumacher by 2 seconds at the end of the first lap, with Hill third, then Salo, Alesi and Frentzen in the top 6, followed by Katayama and Herbert. Salo had a lazy right behind him, but Berger had got away very badly from the second start and was back in 12th, between Suzuki and Martini, and both Ferraris were finding out about how difficult passing was on this track. Irvine's nose replacement had taken long enough that he not only rejoined last, but was lapped by Coulthard on lap 4 as he continued pulling away from Schumacher, who was looking in his mirrors at Hill as both came past Irvine in their turn. The pair were having a terrific battle over second place, Damon clearly able to go faster but stymied by Schumacher's defensive driving, until suddenly, on lap 6, they both shot past Coulthard, whose engine management software had glitched and cut the power entirely. Just as they went past, it restarted again, David leaving black lines on the track as he stood on the throttle to get going. So the terrific battle over second became a terrific battle for the lead, and meanwhile Herbert had got past Katayama to go up to 7th and was chasing Frentzen at the points. With the cameras understandably sticking with the leaders, Alesi finally made his way past Salo on lap 7, as Irvine's race ended with a broken oil line and a lot of smoke, and Panis came in to change tyres after getting a puncture, presumably on one of the many little shards of carbon fibre strewn about the place. By lap 10, a recovering Coulthard had got right back on Hill's gearbox, but it was quickly becoming evident that either the circuit was especially hard on tyres, or the new Goodyears weren't up to much, or both, as several of the lower orders started coming in already to change sets. Inoue, Martini and Schiattarella all came in to see if it was just their set that was a problem, while Schumacher and Herbert were both finding that the Benetton seemed to particularly dislike the new rubber. Certainly Schumacher was struggling much harder to keep Hill behind him than you'd usually expect. The three shot past Diniz as if he was standing still, Coulthard clearly not in the mood to defer to Hill either. Lapping Moreno and two of the men who'd already stopped proved no problem either. Blundell walked away from his smoking McLaren, but no time to watch that as Hill got into Schumacher's slipstream and at the start of lap 11 slingshotted past him into the lead, the first time he'd overtaken Michael in a straight-up fight on the road. As Hill put his foot down, it was now Coulthard looking this way and that for a way through. Behind these three, Alesi was a rather distant fourth, some 20 seconds off the lead and 9 seconds ahead of Salo, holding a comfortable fifth, 18 seconds ahead of Frentzen, who now had Herbert close behind and Berger bearing down on the pair of them, with Verstappen up to 9th and Katayama 10th. It was starting to get into the window for the first of the three stoppers. Usually in 1994 and at Brazil, Benetton had preferred 3 stops and Williams 2, but if that was the case here, then Schumacher was in even more trouble than it seemed, because it certainly didn't look like he was running lighter than the Williams behind him, or the one ahead, as Hill was fairly storming off into the distance, putting 4 seconds between himself and Schumacher in a couple of laps. Coulthard was clearly desperate to get past and get back on terms with Hill, but this was still only his 10th Grand Prix, and Schumacher knew exactly how to keep people behind him. Salo came in from 5th and emerged 11th on lap 14, possibly another victim of the on-track debris, which had also seen Moreno in, as well as Panis. Berger cruised in, convinced something had broken on his suspension and turned into the garage ready to retire, but the Ferrari mechanics found he too had a slow puncture, pushed him back out into the pit, put new boots on and sent him out 16th, and just as that was happening, Schumacher came to lap Martini, who proved unusually obstructive, slowing the Benetton just enough for Coulthard to emulate Hill, get a toe up the start-finish straight, and dodge between the two cars to go second, putting Martini between the two of them to boot, and allowing himself to get away. Hill had a 12-second lead when he came into the pits on lap 16, and a long 13.5-second stop got him out in 3rd, so Williams were going for 3 stops, or had they just made a very early first stop of 2 to get fresh tyres on and put in enough fuel for a long middle stint? We would see. But no sooner had Coulthard regained the lead than his engine control unit packed up for good, and he pulled off, putting Schumacher into the lead, but only for the rest of that lap as the Benetton peeled in at the end of it, putting Alesi into the lead. Schumacher's stop was nearly twice as quick as Hill's, but he still rejoined the track 3rd, nearly 18 seconds behind Damon. So on lap 20, as Hill set a new fastest lap, Alesi led by 2.5 seconds, with Schumacher 3rd, then Herbert, who'd made his way up to 4th, nearly 30 seconds behind his team leader, with Frentzen 5th, a few seconds behind him, and Verstappen now in the points in his Simtek ahead of Morbidelli, Salo and a charging Barrichello, all running within a few seconds of each other. Hill was chasing down Alesi, but it was Damon's turn to have problems getting past Martini, and it looked like Ferrari were going for a 2-stop strategy, which made Alesi's performance in what was therefore a heavier car look even better. But he was held up a little lapping Panis, who was in turn lapping Inoue, allowing Hill to catch up. Schumacher, meanwhile, was dropping even further back, still having trouble getting his car to work on the new tyres. Verstappen made his first stop, as did Herbert, promoting Frentzen back up to 4th, and Hill was still in Alesi's wheel tracks, evidently having decided to wait for the Ferrari to stop, with the mechanics out in the box ready. Verstappen rolled in again with a broken gearbox, just as, on lap 26, in the window for a two-stop race, Alesi came in, and with Schumacher 22 seconds behind the leaders, it was a race to see if he could get back out on track ahead of the Benetton. He could, so with the first round of stops complete, Hill led Alesi by 24 seconds, with Schumacher just behind the Ferrari, then Frentzen 50 seconds behind his fellow countryman, then Herbert 5th, and Sarlo 6th and the last man unlapped. If anyone was expecting a fine scrap between Alesi and Schumacher over second, they were to be disappointed, as the Ferrari simply drove away from the Benetton, though a little group of Panis, Morbidelli and Barrichello gave them some trouble and allowed Michael to catch back up again. Frentzen, running a one-stop race, made it on lap 32 of the 72, so a little way before half-distance, and the next time round Hill was in for his second, with a 33-second lead. A smooth stop and he was back out in the lead. Barrichello pulled off with a smoking Peugeot, an oil line broken just like on Irvine's car, as Hill came round to lap Frentzen, now 6th, and Schumacher came in for his second stop. The mechanics couldn't get his fuel nozzle connected and had to give it another go, which made that one a long stop. So on half distance, Hill had a lead of about 9 seconds over Alesi, with Schumacher a full 30 seconds behind the Ferrari in third, then Herbert another 45 seconds back, with Sarlo now up to 5th after Frentzen's stop, with Morbidelli and Panis 7th and 8th, and Berger having climbed back up to 9th after his disastrous stop. The Austrian came in for his second stop, which went considerably better than the first one. Alesi, meanwhile, was absolutely flying, closing the gap to Hill to within 7 seconds and lapping Berger on lap 46, while Morbidelli, having made his way back up into the points, retired with a short circuit and was followed into retirement a couple of laps later by his countryman Martini, who spun and stalled. Alesi came up behind Herbert to lap him, but Johnny peeled into the pits at the end of the lap, and then next time round Alesi was in, having closed the gap to within 4 seconds. A smooth 8-second dead put him back out, still comfortably second, so now it came down to Hill's third and final stop, which he made on the next lap, 7.9 seconds, almost the same. A Ferrari flashed past the end of the pit lane as he exited, but it was Berger, and as Hill regained the track, Alesi was just coming onto the start-finish straight. With 22 laps left, it was now a straight race to the finish. Sarlo went to put a lap on Suzuki, but the Ligier moved over on him and contact was made, bouncing the Tyrrell over into the gravel trap and out of a points finish. A livid Sarlo climbed out of his car while Suzuki turned in to retire with suspension damage. That left 11 cars still running, with Berger now up into the points after Panis made his second stop. Alesi was within 5 seconds of Hill still, but the Ferrari just wasn't quite as fast as the Williams on full tanks, and Damon was able to pull out a bit, while way back in third, Schumacher made his third stop and seemed to have finally got a set of tyres working for him, as on lap 55 he set what would turn out to be the fastest lap of the race. By lap 58 it looked like it was all over, as Hill made the gap 10 seconds, and the last remaining on-track fight was over the last point between Berger and a recovering Panis. Gerhard was, as of this race, the driver with the most F1 starts for Ferrari of all time, and while it hadn't exactly gone the way he'd hoped, if he scored at least a point he would retain the championship lead heading to Ferrari's home race at Imola, unless of course Schumacher and Coulthard were reinstated on appeal, which would be heard before the San Marino Grand Prix. Sarlo arrived back at the pits still absolutely fuming and went straight to the Ligier garage to confront Suzuki. The French mechanics had to physically restrain him from punching Aguirre in the face, but Suzuki, apparently unabashed, offered to meet him behind the garages later to settle things man to man. Once the two had been separated and calmed down a bit, Mika found time to talk to Tony Jardine for the BBC coverage.
Mika, understandably you're fairly upset. What's your version of the event?
Well, it was going quite all right. I had no problems with the car. Everything was just fine. And I told, when I got Suzuki and I couldn't get through of him first 2 laps, and I radioed the pits and said that I have a problem with Suzuki and he will take me off. He tried a couple times more early already, and he locked the brakes and he went wide and he came back straight in front of me and just tried to cut me off. And I told the pits the same thing with the radio, and then half a lap later he just took me off. I'm very happy they replaced him with Martin Brundle after this race, because guys like that shouldn't be here.
Back on track, the last few laps were fairly uneventful as Hill cruised home to his 10th win, with Alesi a very fine second, just under 6.5 seconds behind in the end, and Schumacher an uncharacteristically distant third. Herbert scored his first Benetton points in 4th, Frentzen scored the first points for the Red Bull-Sauber-Ford combination in 5th, and Berger took the final point for Ferrari to at least leave Argentina still the championship leader, even if he might not arrive at the next race still on top of the table. Panis, Katayama and Schiatarella were 7th, 8th and 9th, with both 40s making the finish, albeit 9 laps down apiece, meaning they hadn't completed enough of the race to be classified finishers. For the first time since really the end of 1993, Williams had comprehensively outperformed Benetton, with Schumacher definitively laying the blame on Goodyear's new tyres, which Damon Hill agreed with, saying the heavy rain over the weekend until race day itself had coated the track with a thin film of dust which stuck to the tyres, and that he'd also found his car understeering. Why it had affected him much less than Schumacher, he couldn't say. All eyes would now turn to Paris in 4 days' time for the appeal against Brazil's disqualifications to be heard, and then onwards to Imola, where no doubt there would be more memorialising of Ayrton Senna, a year on from that black weekend.